For me, the journey, and this is what I would reinforce with someone at my going through what I went through, you are born worthy. That worthiness is your birthright. That's what you have failed to remember. Buddhism, we say you are born basically good. And, there's an apocryphal story of an American coming to the Dalai Lama during a public talk and describing how in Western societies people question their worthiness. And His Holiness put his head in his hand and just almost started crying. And he said, "What is it about you?" Meaning you as a people, who forget that your humanity is evidence of your worthiness. See, in Tibetan culture, we take rebirth, and the fact that we have been born human is evidence that in a past life we did something right. Because only human beings can attain enlightenment. So just the fact that you're human is evidence of your birthright of love, safety, and belonging. Isn't that cool?
Okay, Jerry, welcome to the show. To get started, you've written a fantastic book called Reunion. The first thing I'd like to ask is, how did the process of writing this book change you? How is your inner life different now than it was before you started it?
Oh, wow. My first book, Reboot, came out in 2019. And I wrote that book retrospectively. I wrote that book after the fact to describe what my life was like in the previous decades. And the subtitle of that book is Leadership in the Art of Growing Up. So to position it, it was, and this is what happened to me and formed who I am, so that I could then model an inquiry process for someone else to do the same kind of work. Reunion, the subtitle of which is Leadership and the Longing to Belong, I wrote in a kind of as it was happening to me. I embarked on a journey that I didn't know the end of the story. I didn't know what was going to happen. So when you ask the question, how did it change me? I don't know that an hour is enough time to list all the ways in which I was changed as a consequence of that book. You've read it, so you know some of the facts of the matter, right? For example, so the basic premise, and it's important to name this. My first book is really centered around the question of how have I been complicit in creating the conditions they say I don't want? And that question, people love that question. It's a really challenging coaching question. It's a really challenging question for any of us at any moment in our life. The second book is really built around a similar offshoot question, which is how have I been complicit in and benefited from the world I say I don't want to see? And specifically, a world where people hate each other, a world where an entire people can be subject to genocide for who they believe is God, how they worship, how they love, the color of their skin. I mean, an extraordinary question. And as I try to do with everything, I try not to ask my reader or my clients, for that matter, to do something that I myself am not willing to do. And so the book, Reunion, is really an attempt for me to come to grips with how have I been complicit in and benefited from a world I say I don't want to see. And that as I unpack that, what I had to do was come into relationship with ancestors of mine who might deny that they even existed. So I'll pause there because that one question could send me off for the next hour.
And there's quite a few directions I could go here. I think what's top of mind for me is maybe if we could explore the relationship being cut off from our ancestral lineage and our ability to turn a blind eye to the systemic othering that goes on in society today.
God bless you for connecting those two. I mean, look, when I endeavored to write a book to address the what we're both calling the systemic othering, and I want to acknowledge the work of John A. Powell, who identified that as a phrase to describe the kind of prejudice, racism, misogyny, ethnic cleansing that is so prevalent in our societies. When I endeavored to lean into that question, uh, uh, I had to acknowledge that I don't have an answer to how to end this. I really don't. And this is not a book that's designed to, follow these 5 steps and then all of a sudden we're going to live in we're going to coexist in peace and harmony. But what I came to test was a simple thesis, which was, and I used myself as the test case, which was that the experience of cutting ourselves off from our ancestors, cutting ourselves off from the parts of ourselves that we do not like, which I know to be a phenomena in psychology anyway, exacerbates the cutting off from each other. So let me be more specific. The fact that most Americans, and it's a very American book, I want to acknowledge that, most Americans do not see themselves as children of immigrants, not second and third generation, means that our ability to empathically connect with those who want to migrate here is cut off. So instead of seeing my ancestors as fleeing poverty, political or religious persecution, and trying to establish a place where their descendants could be free and live, I see migrants as the other, as a threat. I mean, look, I'll reference Ireland for a moment, just briefly. You and I both know that there's pressure in society for migrants. And yet, of all people who might understand the near genocidal consequences of systemic othering, who knows this better than the Irish? Who didn't just experience it in their homeland when they were colonized, sorry to get all radical on your head, but experienced it when they traveled to places like the United States. No Irish or dogs apply, right?
For sure.
And yet there's something profound when we can connect with I think of our ancestors because I am in a privileged position right now, right? I can stand up and say, it's my country. It's 2 generations back. My grandparents who couldn't say that. And what if we just sort of tore down those barriers and said, wait a minute, just like my grandparents, just like my great grandparents, that person is just seeking a better life for themselves. Sure, I want people to follow rules, and but for heaven's sake, what do our wisdom traditions teach us about welcoming the stranger, welcoming the refugee? What? Where is compassion? Where is empathy? And relevant to this question, because I write for leaders, what is the role and responsibility for somebody who carries a title like CEO? What is the role and responsibility of someone who has power in a world where, as happened in the United States, a 7-year-old child can be stabbed to death because of their Palestinian heritage? Where are our elders who know better, who should be standing, telling us, who are telling us, sit up straight and do better, be kind? I'm going to imagine for a moment that your grandmother was a lovely person. Is that true?
For sure. Yeah.
What would she tell you about being kind?
Probably that it's one of
Right?
the most important things in life.
In fact, she might hit you in the head if you weren't kind.
For sure.
Right? So when I talk about ancestors, that's what I want to make vivid. What would her grandmother have said to her when she was a child? Remember that person. So, sorry, you got me going. If you pull the string behind my back, I will talk for hours. So,
No, it's a fascinating, I suppose, line of exploration, and it's something I would never have connected before I read the book. But this idea of we can have an empathetic experience of the other in society today by tracing our own lineage back, and realizing that we are the people we are today because others accepted us into society,
that's
or
it.
gradually.
Or we fought our way into that. There's a powerful book about the Irish experience in the United States called "How the Irish Became White." I mean, just pause. The thesis of the book, implicit in the title, is that at one point the Irish were not white, and that is part of the experience. We're focused on the Irish, but the same is true for many, many ethnicities. It's like, what is that experience? And this is my thesis, and it's rooted in my Buddhism, which is that by connecting with one's own experience, not narcissistically, not self-indulgently, but by connecting with one's own experience, and by extension, the experience of our ancestors, we can then create an empathetic bridge to the other person. I mean, I evoked it when I just asked you to remember your grandmother. Remember all the people who tried to make sure that Nile did right for the world? They weren't all great. And sometimes they may have been violent. Sometimes they may have been hurtful. They all struggled. All of them. I mean, you asked before, how was I changed? Part of this exploration, as you know, was an exploration of my father's roots. And as we exchanged on email, and as you came to read, my father's biological mother was born in Ireland, in Tipperary, not far from Turles. She gave birth in the United States, raised my father for 18 months, and then gave him up for adoption. And then eventually went back to Ireland. And as part of my reunion with the past, I walked amongst the bones of my ancestors. I walked in the churchyard. I knelt at her grave and I wept because I was angry at her. How could you have done this to him? How could you leave an 18-month-old child? And like many of my father's generation, he struggled with alcoholism. And for much of my life, I blamed his alcoholism on her. How have I changed? With empathy. I see my grandmother as a scared and lonely 20-year-old, 21-year-old kid, overwhelmed, not sure what to do, in a society where it would have produced an enormous amount of shame to have had a child out of wedlock. I see her placing her son in the hands of nuns in the hopes that he had a better life. I came into relationship with my father in a new way. What was it like? Because as you know from reading the story, he did not know that he had been adopted until his wedding day, when the only woman he knew as his mother was an Italian woman, Italian-American woman, who in her anger at him marrying my mother stood at the back of the church and screamed, "You're not my son, you were adopted." For the first time in my life, I had to ask the question, what was it like to have been rejected by not one, but two mothers? What does it do to a man? The journey towards what I call systemic belonging and my responsibility to belonging for me began with understanding to whom and to where I belong. To look, to walk amongst, the torn down, thatch roofed, the thatch was all gone, the home that my grandmother was born in, where the source of water, and it was a little township, 6 buildings, where the source of water was a hand pump. To imagine her as a little girl, to use the phrase, fetching a pail of water. It enabled me to connect to your ancestors. I don't know what part. I'm imagining you grew up in Ireland. I'm imagining your ancestors are from Ireland. What part of them suffered through the famine? What part of them were part of the liberation efforts in the early 20th century? What part of them lived through the Troubles? What are we to do? Forget that there was effectively a civil war with outside forces stoking it? Are we to forget that? And if we remember that, can we look at what's going on in Palestine today with a new eye? Can we look at what's going on the border between Cambodia and Thailand? Can we look at the value of peace so that a little kid can have food? Look at what's happening right now in Gaza. We can empathetically look at what's happening in Gaza without letting off the hook those responsible for deprivation and murder wherever they have power. I think this is our moral and ethical responsibility as leaders. I think this is why our ancestors suffered what they did, so that I can come forward and say, God gave me the gift, and maybe it's my Irish heritage. God gave me the gift to be able to speak in such a way that people listen to me, to write in such a way that people read. What will I do with that gift? Will I convince you that there's a better way to be a CEO? Yeah, there is. Or will I challenge you to be the best possible human being you can be, as I do the same thing for myself?
The image that comes to mind for me, Jerry, and this might be off, but it's just what comes up. When you look at your journey from a bird's eye view, there's a sense of there was an uprooting whenever you discovered that your ancestors weren't Italian, and I imagine that must have been very unsettling and anxiety provoking, and a loss of identity there. Was like, who am I? You know.
To whom do I belong?
And then gradually you find your way to Tipperary and the grave of your grandmother and all the rest, and there's a rerouting there. And it seems to me that this is fundamental for our general sense of well-being in life, to be rooted in the past, to have this kind of connection to the past, and there's a responsibility that comes along with that. And whenever we're cut off from it, like most of us are in modern society, whenever we're cut off from our ancestral lineage, then we sort of feel like we're kind of floating around in space, and we can get away with destroying the planet, treating each other like shit, etc., etc. So I think there's a big connection here that's really fundamental.
God bless you, man. You just said it better than I could. And you're right. You used a really important word: rootedness and rootlessness, right? So many peoples have been subjected to diaspora. Think of those who passed through the Middle Passage and from Africa to the Americas, just the Americas. Your own ancestors. Think about them, being as indentured servants in places like Jamaica, let alone transported to Australia or Tasmania. Think about the diaspora. Think about the migration of people. It's happening in the Americas right now. Those from places like Venezuela or Haiti and Central America, trying to find their way. And they're doing it not because they willingly choose to be rootless. They do it because they want to survive, or more, they want their children to survive, right? Why risk a journey, in a raft, or the equivalent of a raft, across the Mediterranean Sea to get to some place like Spain or Italy, so that you could possibly enter the EU and possibly find a way to a job, right? Think of those folks. I I was raised a Catholic, and like many, when I was an early teenager, I was like, the heck with going to church, right? And I found my way through my own struggles to Buddhism in my 30s. And yet, some of those teachings stay with me. Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes. As part of the journey of reading this, of preparing and writing this book, I read a great sermon by the Black mystical preacher Howard Thurman, called Jesus and the Disinherited. Jesus and the disinherited. And he argues forcefully that Jesus came for the least of us, not for those in power. Jesus, brown Jesus, Aramaic speaking Jesus, poor Jesus, an immigrant Jesus, a refugee Jesus, a homeless and rootless Jesus came for those who are disinherited, those whose land was taken from them, those whose lives were taken from them, and disinherited from that which was by rights theirs, their birthright. He wrote that, he taught that in the 1950s. He was an inspiration for Martin Luther King Jr. and for a whole generation of people. I wrote this book because of what I see is at stake right now. Our humanity. How do we turn a blind eye to starvation? How is it that we turn a blind eye? It's only by dismembering our memories and the source of our compassion that we're able to be complicit in the dehumanization of other people.
100%. So I spent a fair amount of my 20s and up until I was probably 32, 31, 32. I did quite a bit of traveling. I was living over in Canada for a while, and it was fun. It had its time, but I kind of, when I was over there halfway across the world, I just had the sense like I was kind of living on flat land almost. There was no depth. There was no connection to anything that had gone before. And it all felt very surface level. I don't know why. I just had that instinct. And I was like, I kind of want to be home. I kind of want to be closer to home, So I moved back maybe about nearly 2 years ago. And since I've got back, like, I've made a conscious effort to re-engage with the culture that I emerged from. And I'm very lucky to still have grandparents that are alive. So that involves spending a lot of time with them and just asking them about their life growing up, their parents, their grandparents, their context, And for whatever reason, I don't know if that's linked or not, but for whatever reason, I do feel more rooted and at home in the world. So I definitely think there's something huge to what you're sharing in this book. I'm sure you've thought very deeply about this, Jerry, but are there how are there any ways you've found it really effective to reconnect with your heritage, apart from what the most common ways? Any ways you've found to be really effective for reconnecting to the past?
Well, I think that you'll relate to this. As you were describing your journey, I was thinking about the fact that in a few weeks, I'm going to be traveling to Italy, to Puglia in the south, outside of Bari. And my youngest son, Michael, his wife, Neve, and my daughter, Emma, and her husband, Joe, and I are going to travel to Palo de Col, which is the small village where my grandparents were born, my father's adopted parents and my mother's parents. So they're all from the same village. And the reason I was thinking of that, and I also was thinking about, as part of this journey, I went back to Brooklyn. There's a little video, it's maybe about 7 or 8 minutes, on reunion.reboot.io that has me going back to Brooklyn, which is what I consider my rootedness, right? And, going to places like Coney Island and visiting St. Jerome's Roman Catholic school where I went to school. And the point is this: there is something really powerful for those of us who are lucky enough to be able to walk the streets that our grandparents walked, to look at the slant of light and to see, what does sunrise look like? What does sunset look like? There's a poem that I quote in Reunion multiple times. It's by Joy Harjo. And she says, I'm going to read it to you. She writes, this poem is called Remember. And Joy Harjo was the poet laureate for the United States. She's an indigenous woman. Remember the sky that you were born under. Know each of the stars' stories. Remember the moon. Know who she is. Remember the sun's birth at dawn. That is the strongest point of time. Remember sundown and the giving away tonight. Remember your birth, how your mother struggled to give you form and breath. You are evidence of her life and her mother's and hers. Remember your father. He is your life also. Remember the earth whose skin you are. Red earth, black earth, yellow earth, white earth, brown earth. We are earth. Remember the plants, trees, animal life, who all have their tribes, their families, their histories too. Talk to them. Listen to them. They are alive poems. Remember the wind. Remember her voice. She knows the origin of the universe. Remember you are all people, and all people are you. Remember, you are this universe, and this universe is you. Remember, all is in motion, is growing, is you. Remember, language comes from this. Remember the dance language is, that life is. Remember. By Joy Harjo.
Wow.
Yeah, wow, right? You asked a how question, and Joy Harjo is giving us the answer. You going back, where are you from in Ireland?
County Derry.
In the north, right? Close to the border.
Yeah.
Well, let's remember them. Those who carried the troubles. May they rest in peace. You remembering that land, and what does that land smell like in springtime? What do the flowers look like? What does the sun look like at sunrise? That is how you will stay rooted. And then you go forth into the world. You can live in Dublin. You can create this summit where you're creating opportunity for all these other people, and you're creating, the mechanism for this crazy poetic coach from Boulder, Colorado, born in Brooklyn, to speak to a bunch of people. What is this about? What is he talking about? But stay rooted. Remember. I often say that I think of that word remember in opposition to the word dismember. And so if you hyphenate the word, re-member, it means to bring back together that which had been separated. Just, by the way, as the word religion means, to bind together that which had been separated. So we do that work internally, just like we do in coaching all over. We reconnect with the parts of ourselves that we are often disconnected from, dismembered from, as a source of our strength. I'll be more specific. Okay, so you have power, you are a CEO, you lead people. Isn't it important to remember what it's like to be led? Do you remember the first day you went to work as an adult? And your hopes and dreams and fears and insecurities? Do you think it could possibly enhance your leadership to remember who that person was? So that when you walk in at the next all hands meeting and you look out and you see some summer intern who's scared, who's carrying the hopes and dreams of her ancestors on her shoulders, and you start to endeavor to build a culture where everybody feels like they belong? What? You think this might be a good thing? So yeah, I endeavor to speak to a larger world. I'm getting old. I'm going to be 62 this year. I'm going to be a grandfather. I am fully embracing my elder nature. So I'm going to speak about big things, but I'm not going to disconnect from the smaller things. Being the CEO of a 500-person company, trying to make payroll, trying to keep the container of the business leak-proof, trying to stay connected with what is important in the world. The gift of our ancestors, Niall, yours and mine, it's the gift of poetry. That Celtic imagination. It's the ability to sit around a fire and tell a story, to bind people to a cause. What is leadership but that? To sit around the fire and tell stories, to imagine impossibilities, and to move them to greatness. As I said, you let me go, I will keep going. So,
what came to mind for me there was, as you were saying the poem and everything, to remember to me is to re-embody, and to reintegrate these parts of ourselves that we've cut off from ourselves, and the more you are re-embodied, the more whole you are, the less you are able to others, if you know what I mean. It becomes more and more difficult. So this work is so important. This next direction I want to go in, Jerry, is maybe a little bit off topic, but it was an idea from the book that really jumped out at me because you very rarely hear it. But you said in the book that letting go of the idea of meritocracy was very liberating for you. So can you maybe just share your experience here and your thinking behind this? Because this is a very countercultural idea.
well, what's the cultural idea around meritocracy that you are encountering, that you're holding, and then I can respond to the question.
The idea of being self-made and pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps and doing that is the highest value in society. So that's what we should all be aiming for.
Yeah, it's a powerful story, isn't it? It's a powerful myth. In the States, there's a famous kind of crappy set of stories called the Horatio Alger stories, in which there were these stories of pulling oneself up by one's bootstrap and making a go of things oneself. I want to parse things out, though. I'm a huge fan of people working hard to overcome that which the hand that they were dealt. I think of myself as having done that, right? I will laugh and people will say, well, you're so successful. And I say, well, do you see how hard I work? Right? And I often think of that Carl Jung quote, I am not what has happened to me. I am what I choose to become. There's agency in that. There's power in that. And it connects back to the mythology that we associate with this notion of meritocracy. The problem with meritocracy as a concept is that it presumes equity. It denies inequity. It denies structural disadvantage. It denies the reality. And the most challenging aspect of it is that when that construct is internalized, the person who struggles and wants to take bravery and strength and inspiration from pulling themselves up from their bootstraps, when they struggle, they can internalize a less than self-worth mindset because they have failed to recognize, in some cases, the cards may have been stacked against you. So I want to take what is really powerful and uplifting from all of the mythology and stories around the notion of meritocracy. And I want to expand the understanding to include the recognition that not everyone has the same advantages. I'll tell you, I was talking to a guest for the Reboot podcast, the podcast that I host. And this is a man who spent 19 years incarcerated, including 7 years in solitary confinement. And he's just written a book, and I had him on the show to talk about it. And I'll leave his story to the side for a moment. But one of the things he said that struck me was that he considered himself incredibly privileged because when he entered prison at 19, he could read. He could read, as opposed to most of the other men with whom he was imprisoned. And so he's a brilliant example of redemption. He's a brilliant example of overcoming. He never finished high school. But if you read his writings, if you listen to him speak, he's as well educated as anyone else. Autodidact, self-educated. But he has the brilliance to recognize that he had a privileged advantage over his fellow inmates and that he could read. So hats off to the meritocracy of being able to lift himself up and out of prison. And God bless him for recognizing that he had parents who made sure he knew how to read. That's what I'm talking about. I use the term being liberated from it, but really it's an expansiveness. It's a fullness. It's pushing up against you called it it being countercultural, pushing up against the common sense. Oh yeah, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Well, what if you don't have boots? And what if the reason you don't have boots is structural? What straps are you to pull up? You got to first put some shoes on. There is nothing diminished. There's nothing that takes away from my hard work, from my self-advantages, by recognizing that you might have been born without shoes. What kind of world do I want to live in? What if I endeavored to give everybody shoes? What if we endeavored to give everybody an equitable shot? Sounds like a pretty cool world. And then we competed. That sounds pretty awesome.
For sure. I was at a discussion one evening here in Dublin, actually, and it was about, I suppose, the root causes of homelessness. And the woman was she's making a statement, and she was kind of differentiating between different types of homeless people. And she said, well, let's say the deserving homeless. And I was infuriated. And I was like, well, when you say the deserving homeless, I assume you're talking about someone that's homeless and is a drug addict or whatever. And it's like, well, if you're born into a family where with two heroin addicts as parents and you've been abused as a child, then what chance have you got? Like, how could you ever say the deserving homeless? But anyway, it's off.
God bless you for saying that. And how about this? Even if you're not born into a family with two heroin addicts as parents, even if for whatever reason you stumble onto your own opioid addiction, who benefits from the promulgation of opioids? Who makes money off of that addiction? Can we look there? And what do they deserve? In the United States, the Sackler family paid this enormous fine for basically pushing opioid-based OxyContin in a reckless and horrible manner, contributing mightily to an opioid epidemic, many of whom would qualify as your friends deserving homeless. Who are we to the least of these? Shelter, food, clothing, the right to breathe, the right to live. If we as a society and a community do not approach fellow humans with the same empathy, then what are we?
You say in the book, Jerry, something along the lines of, until we feel safety and belonging ourselves, we'll not be able to provide it for others. I'm paraphrasing, but it was along those lines, and it's directed at leaders. And in your own journey, you came from a very hard situation and made yourself. You became wealthy, I think around like mid-40s, and you achieved the goals that you thought were going to give you this lasting contentment and happiness, and that would be sort of like your happily ever after moment. But you got there and it was hollow, and I think you actually you had suicidal thoughts around this time as well. And I suppose if you were able to have a coaching session with Jerry Colonna before you started that journey to up that mountain where you thought, when I get up there, that's gonna make me happy, what would you be saying to that younger version of yourself in that conversation?
Oh, it's a great question. And I actually often think about that because that's what motivates me to do the work I do today. I do envision coaching myself at 38, 39 years old. And what I would say to myself is not that dissimilar to what my then psychoanalyst, Dr. Sayers, would say to me. What will it take, Jerry, she used to say, what will it take for you to feel like you've made it? What will it take for you to feel worthy? Worthy of love, safety, and belonging. Not even what would it take for you to feel loved, safe, and that you belong, but worthy of those feelings. Because she was wise enough to know And I would hope that I am similarly wise enough to know that one of the impediments to feeling loved and safe and that we belong is the feeling of whether or not we deserve those feelings. Now, I'm splitting a hair here that is really important. One of the learned habits that we often have inherited from our parents and grandparents is that we don't deserve to feel safe. I'm about to curse, trigger warning. What a mind fuck. What a mind fuck. One of the ways trauma is perpetuated generation to generation is the sense that, I tell this story in Reboot, my first book. We've talked a bit about my father. One of the most powerful things my father ever said to me acted in a counteracting way. He said to me early on in my career when I was being recruited for a very high position, he said, careful, the higher up the pole the monkey climbs, the more his ass shows. Stay low. Who are you to think you're going to escape this village? Who are you to think you're deserving of an education or you're deserving? Who are you to thinking of my friend that I spoke to yesterday for the podcast? Who are you to think you're going to escape the streets of Detroit by means other than selling drugs? You reference the homeless. Let's take a step back and let's isolate out a form of mental illness that may contribute to homelessness, and let's parse out hopelessness. What percentage of those people, for good reason, have given up hope? And what have we as a society done to contribute to their hopelessness? And who do we want to be? That someone can question their worthiness of love, safety, and belonging because of who they love, because of the color of their skin, because of the language that they speak, because of the God that they worship, because of the gender they identify with. What? What? So yeah, I just tied a bunch of concepts together and played it back to you. But for me, the journey, and this is what I would reinforce with someone at my going through what I went through. You are born worthy. That worthiness is your birthright. That's what you have failed to remember. In Buddhism, we say you are born basically good. In Catholicism, we might talk about being born pure and without sin. And there's an apocryphal story of an American coming to the Dalai Lama during a public talk and describing how in Western societies people question their worthiness. And His Holiness put his head in his hand and just almost started crying. And he said, "What is it about you?" Meaning you as a people, who forget that your humanity is evidence of your worthiness. See, in Tibetan culture, we take rebirth, and the fact that we have been born human is evidence that in a past life we did something right. because only human beings can attain enlightenment. So just the fact that you're a human is evidence of your birthright of love, safety, and belonging. Isn't that cool?
It's very cool. It reminds me a bit of the Sermon on the Mount, which you mentioned earlier as well. The lilies of the field, look how beautiful they're clothed, and how much more would we not be? I'm going to get that wrong, but yeah, basically,
You got the feeling. I mean, every wisdom tradition teaches us the same thing. Whether you believe you're in God's image, or just as a member of the species. And if we can feel that way about ourselves, we can extend that feeling to the homeless person, I don't know. I'm trying to think of on St. Stephen's Green. How's that for a reference?
that's spot on. That's where I get the tram into city centre every day, and that's where I get off at. And there's actually a homeless man sitting there every day that I talk to. So, so there you go, spot on.
And you see his humanity.
100%.
God bless you. Your grandmother will be proud of you.
Well, anyway, Jerry, that's the hour. It's been such a pleasure to have this conversation with you, and to read Reunion. It's not a book I would normally have read, but it really opened my mind up to some new ideas that I feel are so important. So just want to say thank you for writing it and putting it out into the world. I would really recommend people who are listening to this to get a copy. And is there anywhere else you would send people online after this conversation? Any final thoughts you'd like to share?
Well, first, I just want to say thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the close reading of Reunion. It's a difficult book to read. It's a challenging book. Reboot is a challenging book in a different way. It makes people cry. Reunion makes people think, which is what I set out to do. So thank you for the close reading of that. It moved me deeply. In terms of other places, I mean, you can find all things reboot.io. That's the company website. It's podcasts and articles and that sort of thing. But the thing I would leave you with is I'm still struck by the image of you taking the tram to city center and seeing that homeless person every day. And so I would leave you with my gratitude for you seeing that person as a person. And for those listening, the next time you're walking down the street, look in the eyes of somebody else. See if you can imagine their story. Use your empathy to imagine their story. How did they get to be who they are? Just that little step. Maybe, just maybe, we'll address that which ails the world. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure, Jerry. Thank you. If you enjoyed this episode, you might also enjoy getting our 7 Insights newsletter. This is a once per month email where I share 7 of the most valuable insights I've uncovered in the previous 30 days. It includes book, podcast, and documentary recommendations, as well as questions and quotes specifically curated to help you live a more creative, intentional, and meaningful life. It currently goes out to over 50,000 subscribers each month, and if you're interested in joining them, you can sign up at 7insights.org.